So I am delighted to be here. As Jen said, UC Davis and Metrans USC are partners in this National Center for Sustainable Transportation. We were just delighted that USC wanted to come in with us on this venture, and we hope that it is a long-standing relationship. We'll see how that goes. But we have many friends here at USC, and I just love the idea of some further collaborations between the two schools. So I'm going to talk about the future of travel demand, and I'm going to start with a couple of caveats. First, this is a really huge topic, of course, and I'm going to talk about a lot of things, but I'm not going to talk about everything. I'll come back to that at the end. Second caveat is that there is huge uncertainty around the future of travel demand, and I think particularly at this point in time, there are a lot of things going on that we just don't know how it's going to play out. So I'm probably also going to be raising more questions than giving answers in this talk. Now, one of the things we are pretty sure about the future of travel demand is that it is going to involve cars, and if you look around the world, that we are going to see an increase in auto ownership and auto use. And you just look at the global trends, and it is really, really dramatic and stunning. And of course, we worry about this, we transportation folks, for a variety of reasons. One, of course, is the energy that goes into fueling all this automobile use. And of course, another is the implication for greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. And so these are ones we're worrying a lot about in California at the moment. But there are a lot of other reasons to be concerned about, or at least pay attention to, the increase in automobile use around the world, from pollution to the resiliency of our transportation system should big events like Hurricane Sandy come along. Congestion, you all are very familiar with that particular problem. Equitable access to the system. Sprawl, safety, all kinds of reasons we need to be paying attention to how much driving we're doing. And then, of course, the other question is, what do we do about it? And we transportation researchers are spending a lot of time thinking about this. At UC Davis, a lot of my colleagues have focused on reducing the impact of driving through improving vehicles and fuel technologies. We're doing a lot of work on electric vehicles and the uptake of electric vehicles. Infrastructure design, of course, is another way we can think about reducing the impact of driving. And we've got a pavement research center that's looking at different kinds of pavements and permeability and life cycle assessment and all of that sort of thing. But it's pretty clear that that's not enough, that we've also got to think about travel behavior and the choices that people are making about their daily travel, and thinking about how can we get people to do something other than drive. In other words, get people to do the kind of thing that they used to do before we became so dependent on the car. So it turns out that in the US, some of this is already going on. So this particular graph has gotten a lot of attention in the transportation field. The fact that annual vehicle miles traveled per capita seems to be leveling out after decades and decades of growth, and maybe even turning down a little bit. So this is a very big deal. You know, maybe this says that our problems are at least partially solved if we're maybe, at least in the US at this moment in time, we're not continuing to drive more and more, that this is heading us in the right direction. More analysis of this. This is from Garceau, who looked at what was going on in different states and found that by 2011, just about every state had hit what you might call a peak in the growth in VMT, that things had leveled out or started to turn down a bit. So it's not just something that's happening in California, but maybe it's happening sort of everywhere around the US to some degree. This is also echoed in recent data that came out of the US Census, mostly from the American Community Survey, that shows a leveling off in commuting by car. So you can see that flattening out in total. Mostly this is because of a decline in carpooling, but even drive alone has leveled out in recent years. So something's going on. And then of course it's also mirrored in vehicles per capita, which you would think, of course, at some point would hit sort of a saturation point, and we seem to be just about there. Okay, so this is very interesting and kind of optimistic, but they're big questions. So the big questions: why is this happening, and will it last? By understanding what's behind this, we can get a better sense of what we're likely to see in the future. So there's a lot of work going on around these questions, not just at UC Davis, but all over the place. What I want to do with you now is just share some of the thinking about these questions and weave into it some of the specific studies we've done or are in the midst of doing, because a lot of this work is really happening as we speak. So why is this occurring, and will it last? Well, the first thing people thought when they first observed this flattening out of vehicle miles of travel was that, well, it's got to be something about the economy, right? We had that economic downturn in the mid-2000s, mid-aughts. It's got to be tied to that, right? Well, maybe not. One thing people have done is look at vehicle miles of travel over time versus gross domestic product. And you see that, again, for decades and decades, those tracked pretty well. As the economy grew, our vehicle miles of travel grew. But note that the trend in VMT really started leveling off, maybe as early as 2000, long before the economic downturn hit, 5, 6, 7 years later. And then it's interesting to note also that these things seem to maybe not be moving in parallel as much as they used to be. So a number of observers have commented on this and put out some ideas about why this might be true, having to do with information and communications technologies or other things going on in our economy. Okay, so it doesn't appear to be at least just about the economy, that maybe there are other things going on. So again, a number of observers have pointed to other kinds of trends that might explain this, and have looked at this question in the aggregate. So we've got this VMT trend. Let's look at income trends, fuel prices. Well, now they're going the other way, so that can't be explaining the decline in VMT. And a variety of other things going on in the US that might help explain this leveling off of VMT. But I'm a travel behavior researcher, and rather than looking at this question in the aggregate, I like to think about it from the standpoint of individuals. So how each of us makes decisions about our daily travel. And if we're seeing a change in the overall pattern, then that has to come from changes in those individual decisions that we're making. So what I want to do now is sort of think about this from an individual perspective. And what I'm going to start with is a little bit of Travel Behavior 101. So I'm going to throw out a couple of ways that we travel behavior researchers make sense of all of this, and then use that as a framework for looking at some of the things that are going on in society now. So one thing we often do is talk about sort of a nesting of choices. So we may be, as travel behavior researchers, really interested in sort of what you might call short-term choices, the daily choices about do you make a trip or not? Where do you go? What mode do you use to get there? But to understand those choices, you've got to understand longer-term choices that people make. So very long-term choices about lifestyle, where you choose to live, but also these midterm sort of choices about, do you get a driver's license or not? Do you buy a car or not? Now, you may be thinking, well, you know, some of these short-term choices are really midterm choices, and it's true, it's not really this clean, and a lot of these choices are connected with each other. But it is kind of a convenient way to understand how people are making choices. So long-term choices, midterm, short-term. Then the other concept I want to throw out there is the choice process, where we draw on utility maximizing theory from economics to think about how people make choices about their daily travel. And so this is my kind of simplified way to think about that model, is that choices are the outcome of these three things. So first, you got to look at what set of choices are available. So if we're talking about choice of transportation mode, you know, we can look at what sort of modes are available. And note, I do include skateboard on there. I have a PhD student doing his dissertation on skateboarding as a mode of transportation. Yeah, but look around you. You will see some out here. I saw kids today on campus with their skateboards. So anyway, what are our set of choices? What choices are available to us? The second thing then is what are the qualities or characteristics of those choices? So what does each of those cost? What is the travel time for each of those choices? What about other factors like comfort and safety? Each of the different choices offers us different things. And then the third piece of it is the value we put on those different qualities or characteristics. So how important time is relative to cost, relative to comfort, relative to safety. Okay, so our choices reflect all of this together, right? And then just a couple of other things I want to add here is it's important to note that our choices depend not on sort of the reality of what choices are available and what those characteristics are, but our knowledge and perceptions of those choices. Okay, so we do some filtering of the real world, and that's what influences our choices. And then the other thing I would just add to this is all of this is within the context of our needs, you know, where we need to be when, as well as our constraints, what sort of resources we have available to us and all of that. So, grand simplification of the travel behavior, travel choice process. But it provides, I think, a useful framework for looking at what's going on today in transportation and thinking about what that means for the future of travel demand. So I put those two things together to create a nice little matrix. I love matrices. And we've got the different kinds of choices on one axis, it's not showing up, there we go. And then the different sort of parts of the choice process. And if we were to look into each of these different cells of the matrix, we would see interesting and potentially really important change going on that is adding up to these overall changes that we're seeing. I don't have time to look at everything, so I'm going to focus on particular parts of this matrix and spend a little time talking about this. And the first one I'm going to start with is choice sets for short-term choices and choice sets for mode in particular, because this is where a lot of the change is happening and where there's a lot of excitement about what's going on. And you know, if you look around, you see that there does seem to be an explosion in the choices available to us, or at least there's starting to be an explosion in the choices available to us. Most of these, I would say, are sort of variations on traditional modes of transportation, using these modes in different ways, giving us access to them in different ways, but in ways that could have a really big impact on how we travel. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the interesting things going on. And really, for most of these, it's a big question. It's a big question about sort of how that new version of the mode is going to evolve. Are some of the services we're seeing today going to be around in a couple of years, or are they going to have transformed into something else altogether? And then, of course, there are big questions about how we are going to respond to those changes, how we're going to make use of these new services. So, bike sharing, one of my favorites. This one's actually pretty far along at this point, I would say. Hundreds of these, if not thousands, around the world. We have 45 bike sharing systems in the US already, getting pretty high levels of use. Still lots of questions about who is using them and how and for what, and does use of bike sharing, is that complementing transit, making it easier for us to use transit systems? Is it a substitute for transit in some cases? Questions there. Lots of questions about equity around bike sharing. Who has access to these systems? Are they really being designed in such a way that the people who could most benefit from having access to such systems are getting access to such systems? MicroTransit services of various sorts. A lot of these seem to be popping up in San Francisco. I don't know why, but other places as well. Anybody use any of these services yet? So privately operated transit that's at least partially on demand, much higher amenity than what you get in public transit. Costs a lot more than public transit, but you get what you pay for. Big questions here about, well, I think their economic viability over time, but are they competing with public transit? Are they drawing people away from public transit or out of their car? Big implications then for the viability of our public transit systems, as well as this interest in trying to reduce vehicle travel. Looks pretty nice, huh? Who wouldn't want to commute by bus if you can? It's like being in the coffee shop, as a part of your commute. All right. And then, of course, a whole variety of ways we are now getting access to cars without having to own cars. So the first version of this was car sharing, of course, in a number of different systems now, very well established. I imagine USC has Zipcar for students, so you don't have to bring a car here. You can be a member of Zipcar and make use of cars that way. There's a fair bit of research in this area, but still, I think questions about to what degree services like this are encouraging people to give up their own cars and rely on this service instead, and then what that means for how much they're driving. On the other hand, these services could mean that you're giving people access to cars who wouldn't otherwise have access to cars, which could be a very good thing for them and their ability to do what they need to do. But it could mean more driving than we would have otherwise had. And then, of course, there's ride sharing, Uber, Lyft, other versions of this. How many of you have used Uber or Lyft? Yeah, quite a few. I didn't raise my hand. Jen neither, no. Yeah, so this is just exploding, obviously. But again, big questions about how these services are going to evolve, what the policy is going to be around these services, and then how people are going to use them. So at the moment, these are set up as what you might call sequential car sharing. So it's like a taxi. I use it, and then Jen uses it, and then Dowell uses it. But some of these services are working on versions that would be more about sharing rides. So we might, even if we're not going to exactly the same place, we might spend at least some of our ride together in the car to make things more efficient. So which of these ways it evolves, really significant implications for how much driving we end up having. And then, of course, there's the autonomous vehicle. So this is, the big thing everybody's wondering about and talking about. I picked this image because I think it reflects my feeling about it, a little bit ominous. I guess I'm not so sure about this. A lot of uncertainty about when exactly this is going to roll out to begin with. And then again, lots of uncertainty about kind of how it's going to roll out, what form it's going to take. Are we all going to individually own an autonomous vehicle? Am I going to, if I work in downtown San Francisco where parking is really expensive, does my car drive me there and then go home to park and then come back and get me? So it could mean a lot more driving. Shared cars individually used, does Uber become Uber without drivers? Or shared cars with shared rides? This is kind of getting us to the personal rapid transit that those of us who got in the field a long time ago used to hear all about, right? It's personal rapid transit without rails. So again, how the service evolves here, really big implications for how much driving we end up with. Okay, so that's that lower left cell, all kinds of interesting things going on. Now the other part of this I want to talk about is over on the right, and I think of this as how we think about transportation, what's important to us as we're making these choices. And of course here, the big focus has been on millennials. Okay, millennials roughly, Dal, you can correct me, 17 to 35, thereabouts. Okay, how many of you are under 35? Okay, so we got a lot of millennials here. Now, I think those of us who aren't millennials, we have our millennial anecdotes. So mine are my niece Allison on the left, who grew up in the suburbs, but is now living a car-free life in San Francisco, making use of all of these different modes. And then my other anecdote is my own daughter, Hannah, who last year got her driver's license before any of her friends, even though she was by no means the first to turn 16. She got her license not so much because she wanted to, but because I was sick of driving her around. So I wanted her to get her license, and let me tell you, it changed my life. It's been great. And this is, bicycle researcher, right? Saying it's good. She still bikes to school. She can't drive to school, but after school activities, she drives herself. Okay, so something is different, right? I mean, when I was, okay, so you millennials, how many of you got your driver's license before you turned 17? Quite a few. So how many of you did not get a license by the time you were 17? All right, see? Now how many of you baby boomers got your license by the time you were 17? Anybody not? All right, so we have a couple, but it's changed, right? So this is actually one of the most documented parts of what's going on with millennials is this delay in driver's licensing. So this is data from Steve Polson there. And you can see he looked at data from 1995 and 2011. And what this shows is that 16 to 19-year-olds in 2011, the percentage of those with driver's licenses, it was 9% less than in 1995. In other words, in that relatively short period of time, younger people are much less likely to be licensed than they were before. In our own data, we've done some looking at this and tried to do some exploration of why this might be. This data comes from our annual campus travel survey that we do at UC Davis. So this is students, faculty, and staff. We get a nice age range there. And we see this in our data as well. So the millennials, just over 50% got a license within 1 year of eligibility. But if you look at my generation, the baby boomers, it was at least 75%. So big difference, right? Now the question is why? What's going on? So we asked a whole bunch of questions on the survey to try and understand this. And one thing we were thinking is that it might have to do with a change in attitudes, right? So when I was 16, cars, it was all about cars, right? And you're going to get your license and you're going to have some car you were going to drive around. So we asked a question like this. Driving was the coolest way to get to school. Agree, disagree. And no, yeah, I mean, it turned out that Gen Xers, those in the middle there, middle age ranges, were more likely to agree with that statement than either the millennials or the baby boomers. So we didn't really find much in attitudes and the other kinds of attitudes we looked at that seemed to explain what was going on with millennials. But you know what we did find? Parents. That it was about parents. So the millennials were much more likely to say that their parents were happy to drive them around places than in my generation, where we were left to our own devices and had to bike anywhere we wanted to go after school. So, and there were some other things about parents that seemed to factor in as well. So that's sort of interesting, that maybe it's not just about millennials being different, but maybe it's also about parents of millennials being different than parents of the baby boomers. We did some multivariate analysis that you can look at in hopefully our paper that will be accepted by the Transportation Research Board for the conference in January. But this is one of the outputs of that modeling, and essentially it shows the the likelihood of a delay in licensing by age. And so what I want to point out here is that even after we control for all kinds of things, we do see an age effect where people under about 35 are more likely to have delayed getting their license. And then after that, it's pretty constant. So again, it points to something going on with the millennials. And what it is, we're still trying to sort out. We did look at this in another study that was presented at last year's TRB conference. This is from a survey we did at 3 high schools, Davis High School and then 2 others in Northern California. That was mostly about bicycling, but we did ask some questions about driver's license. And then again, did some modeling to try and figure out what factors were most important in explaining a delay in licensing. So what this shows you is that students who like riding the bus or could rely on their parents to drive them were less likely to have gotten their driver's license on time. And then above 0, they're more likely to have gotten their license on time. So if they thought driving was cool, they were a little more likely to get their license on time. Stuff to carry, practical issue, after-school activities, more likely. And then this one was kind of interesting. This came out to be one of the most important predictors of getting your license on time, was having a smartphone. And what was interesting about this is that the hypothesis that people have put out there is the reverse of that. That kids who are spending all their time on their smartphones aren't as interested in driving. And they're too busy doing what they do on their smartphone. They might want to be on the bus where they could be using their smartphone instead of driving, where they can't use their smartphone. But we didn't find that at all. It was completely the opposite effect. And actually, what we think this is really an income effect. So it's sort of hard to tease that out. And we couldn't really ask high school students their parents' income. Is kind of an awkward thing. So we had some other proxies in there, but I think this is mostly an income effect. But interesting that it is opposite to what others have proposed. Okay, so that's some of what we know about the licensing part of millennials. There's other data being collected out there that points to other things going on with them that are different, some of which have to do with those longer term choices. So things about lifestyle. Millennials get married later than earlier generations, and that has implications for travel. A lot more social media, which I think is related to just a very different way they organize their activities, and they're doing different kinds of activities. So this is data from the Pew Research Center. Recent study led by Portland State University in conjunction with the National Association of Realtors that found that millennials are more interested in walking and living in walking-oriented environments than older generations. So some of this kind of back to the city idea might be a part of this, and I'm sure Dowell's going to have something to say about that. And some other data, this is from Goldman Sachs, I'm not quite sure why they did this, but that just showed that owning a car doesn't seem to be that important to millennials the way it was for earlier generations. From our own data, ride sharing, use of ride sharing. This is data from San Francisco from almost a year ago. So these bars are probably higher than this by now. But you see much more use of Uber, Lyft kinds of services among millennials than earlier, older generations. Although I was kind of surprised, even the baby boomers, it was at 40% at that point. So the penetration of the service is really pretty remarkable. Okay, and then I've got to mention bicycling here, of course, because I think this is a part of the story too. And what I'm observing, although haven't so much documented, is this kind of growing bike culture among the millennial generation, this kind of coolness of biking, particularly in urban sorts of environments. Bike sharing may be contributing to this. I'm not sure where else it's coming from, but regularly in the New York Times, you'll see these kinds of articles that talk about biking, or talk about biking fashion and different things like that. There's something going on here. Now, what our research suggests is that is really important because one of the biggest predictors of who bicycles is agreement. In every study we've done is agreement with the statement, "I like riding a bike." So we've done a lot of work now to try and understand where that comes from. But I think this idea of a bicycling culture is a big part of this, that if in these places where millennials are concentrating, if biking becomes the cool thing to do, then you see an increase in the share of the population that falls into this strongly agree question, and that will help to contribute to more bicycling. So if you have bicycling questions, we can talk more about that, but that's about all I'm going to say about it here. Oh, except for this one. So e-bikes, electric assist bicycles, another one of these sort of newer mode options available to us. I don't know if you see much of this around LA. I think this is kind of a perfect environment for electric assist bikes, potentially. But we noted that in the Bay Area, there seemed to be a growing number of parents who were purchasing these extended cargo bikes with electric assist and using them as a way to ferry their kids around, get them to and from school. So Allie Thomas, who was a postdoc with us, who's now off in China, did interviews with parents in the Bay Area about why they had chosen to do this, how their friends and family reacted to the fact that they were carrying kids around on these bikes through the city of San Francisco. And again, we hope to present that at TRB this year. So I include this to note that one of the ideas about millennials is, well, they don't have kids yet, and once they have kids, it's all going to change, right? They'll be driving, they'll move out to the suburbs and all of that. But a trend like this suggests that maybe not entirely, that there may be ways that the changes in behavior when you're young and single may carry over with you as you move into the next phase of life. Okay, and then smartphones, like I said, it came out kind of opposite to expectations in our analysis. But clearly they are, they're a huge influence on what's going on. They radically change things. They're changing how we participate in activities, how we plan activities. They're changing how we access transportation and the information we get about transportation. They're changing what we do while we're traveling. So again, lots of questions, I think, about how this plays out and what it means for what we end up choosing to do. And we just don't know quite yet how it all plays out. This week, well, maybe this week, probably next week, we at UC Davis, led by Giovanni Circella, we're going to be launching a survey to try and get at some of these questions about millennials and how they differ from previous generations. So stay tuned. Some of you may be in that sample. And we hope to know a lot more after we implement this 45-minute long survey. Okay, and then just to wrap up kind of this part of my talk, I do want to go back to this graphic about driver's licenses and note that something is also going on at this other end of the age spectrum. That older generations, and especially the baby boom generation, is also not behaving like the generations that came before it. And given that the baby boom generation is the biggest, their choices about travel and driving in particular are really important to pay attention to as well. So that's all I'm going to say about that. But again, this is a whole nother area of research that needs to be done. And we don't have a lot yet on this. Okay, so implications for VMT, all of these changes. It's hard to see what it adds up to yet at this point. And the answer depends really on how the choices end up stacking up. So a lot of the changes that are going on are in favor of alternatives to driving. You know, transit's getting better, it's easier to, you can make use of a car without having to own one, which may mean you end up driving less. Biking is becoming more feasible. We're doing a lot to weight things towards the alternatives. But a lot of these changes are also making driving more attractive. So how is this going to play out? We're sort of doing both things at once. Not entirely clear. Some of the questions that we still need to answer. What substitutes for what? So if you use Lyft or one of these MicroTransit services, what does that replace? Does that replace regular transit, or does it replace driving your own car? Answering that question is very important for understanding what that means for how much VMT we get. Some of these options could mean entirely new travel, that it could be generating travel. Think especially about autonomous vehicles and how much more you might drive around if you can be doing whatever you want while your vehicle is driving you around. So we need to have some understanding of that. And so, a lot of smart people have concluded that we really just can't say yet, where is this trend going to go? Have we really reached peak driving? Is this just a temporary blip and now gas prices are going down, down, down? Maybe VMT starts going up, up, up again. Could it go down further if we make enough progress with these alternatives? It is just really hard to say at this point, which makes it a very exciting time to be a transportation planner, and also a very exciting time to be a transportation or travel behavior researcher, because there are so many questions we need to be answering. But I do want to point out that, of course, some of where that trend goes depends on us, right? And the choices we make about transportation investments and transportation policy. So there was this really interesting week last month where examples of kind of investing in very different ways in the transportation system showed up in the newspaper, all from the West Coast, all within a week. So the first one was Portland, where they opened a new bridge across the Willamette River that can be used by anybody but drive-alone vehicles, or no, maybe private vehicles. So I think it's being used by buses, walkers, bikers, everybody else. That's pretty impressive. San Francisco decided to restrict, again, private vehicles from Market Street. Market Street, major arterial in San Francisco, now closed to private vehicles. So again, it's all transit, bikes, walking. And then I think most stunning of all, but this may reflect my Northern California bias, was LA and their very dramatic decision to take road space from cars and turn it over to transit and bikes. So very big shifts in thinking about investments in transportation that will help tip the balance towards the alternatives. Okay, so we'll see. Now, one thing we're trying to do is make the options good enough to tip the balance, investing in these other modes like Portland, San Francisco, and LA. The other side of it is maybe we shouldn't be thinking so much about making driving nicer, but maybe we should be making driving less attractive if the goal really is to get people to drive less. So it's important to think, both about a carrot and a stick here, right? We need to make the alternatives better, but if we really wanted to discourage driving, we need to be thinking about ways to do that. And I think that's where the really big challenge is that at least in the US, we don't like to do that. And it's politically very difficult. Whether we're talking about pricing, we can't even raise the gas tax to pay for infrastructure maintenance. No way we can increase prices as a way to discourage travel. That's just not politically palatable. Lots of parts of the world, they physically restrict cars in certain parts of the city. Again, that's something we have a hard time doing. So again, if the goal is to reduce vehicle miles of travel or at least prevent it from increasing at the rate it might otherwise, I think the US has to address this side of the equation as well. Now, just to kind of wrap up, of course, talking about restricting driving is a very un-American thing to say, so I'm always a little nervous about saying it. But you got to remember that not all driving is really so valuable, right? That we don't want to encourage driving just for the sake of driving or for the sake of our dogs. We should be walking the dog and not driving the dog. And of course, Jen mentioned, I think a lot about accessibility. Just a reminder that really the goal is about accessibility, getting people to where they need to be, helping them participate in the activities they need and want to participate in. So I'm just going to end with this, this idea I always put out there that really if we're going to deal with this driving problem we have, we've got to stop doing it the old way, which was all about making it easier to drive, focusing on mobility, focusing on level of service, and instead think about transportation in a different way. Focus on accessibility, make it easier for people not to have to drive, give them options, make those options attractive. And this is those projects in Portland, San Francisco, and LA are doing this. It's really thinking about transportation investments and policy in a new way. So that's my little soapbox speech. Just to end, up at Davis, my colleagues always talk about the three-legged stool. So we're focused a lot on California and our climate change policy, our goals about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So three-legged stool, you've got to deal with vehicles, you've got to deal with fuels, and you've got to address travel demand. And they always forget infrastructure, so I throw that back in there. But you'll notice that travel demand leg is wobbly. So travel demand, the wobbly leg of the stool. And what we mean by that is that, fixing vehicles was a hard thing to do, but we've made lots of progress in reducing emissions from vehicles, all of that. Fuels, again, we've made some progress there. That may be harder than fixing the vehicles. But hardest of all is this travel demand piece of it, trying to get people to make different choices than they are. So that's why that's the wobbly leg of the stool. It's the hardest one of these to really get a handle on and to control, although a lot of the problem is a political problem, I would say. But it's an important part of it. It's just a very challenging one. And then my very final slide, I just want to bring it to, again, back to an even bigger picture and note that, of course, I've been focusing exclusively on passenger transportation, our daily travel, right, as we go about our lives. This is only a piece of the whole big picture. There's the whole freight side, which you all here at Metrans do a lot of work on, same sort of issues and changes. going on and being discussed there. And then I would say hardest of all, and really not much yet addressed, at least from a demand standpoint, is the air travel. And I must say, I have to stop flying places to talk about traveling less. And with that, I will end and open it up for questions.
Travel demand analysis so difficult is that changes in demand cause their own demand change. It's like when you build a new lane on the freeway, it instantly fills up because it's a resource that's available. And so you change something and then the demand shifts accordingly. And so you have a continuous dynamic process that's probably pretty hard to pin down.
Yeah, exactly. It is, it's constantly changing. And we do our models that say, here's what demand's going to look like. Let's plan for that. And then we do that. And then that in of itself then changes what people do. So it is a constantly moving target. But that said, there are, that kind of in aggregate, the patterns maybe are not as changeable when you add it all up as when you look underneath and see kind of the individual changes going on.
Do you have mathematical techniques for capturing feedback in that dynamic?
Well, not so well, yeah. So we do these big forecasting models. They are not so good at those feedbacks. Yeah. And that's a problem. But then again, a lot of this is so uncertain that, how you would put that into a model and then use that in forecasting, that's a challenge.
I have a thought and then also a question. When I hear you talk about accessibility, it's interesting because I come from a disability policy background. So when I hear accessibility, I frame it in the context of people with disabilities, physical, intellectual, and developmental. I'm with you on the apprehension of self-driving cars, but I will say, especially among the intellectual and developmental disability community, the idea of self-driving cars can be actually very freeing because so many people, like my brother who has Down syndrome, is very reliant upon my parents still, and he's in his 30s, and then also the disability transportation options are unreliable and unfortunately fraught with a lot of abuses. My question, though, so that was just my thought.
Yeah, excellent point.
The way disability intersects with transportation, I don't know how often it's discussed. But my question is, for the study on millennials and how they're making their transportation choices, is there, I don't know how you would look at it, but is there also a way of measuring, as a part of this messaging of lifestyle change? So instead of wanting to go to a gym, if it's integrated in as a part of your lifestyle for physical health, there's a greater motivation than to take a shared bike or go walking. Is that at all a factor that millennials seem to be, particularly in urban areas, focused on health?
What's tricky about figuring out what's going on with the millennials is that we didn't do the survey in previous years, right? So we didn't ask my generation these questions when we were your age. So it's really hard to be sure about what has actually changed versus what just seems to have changed, especially when you're talking about sort of attitudes and priorities and things that we just don't have data about. I think the health angle motivation is, well, I don't know, you tell me. I mean, is that a big factor in the decisions you're making? It's of great interest to the public health field. They would love for all of you to be thinking about health as you're making your travel decisions. I don't know how much people are doing that.
So first, thank you for a really clear presentation. I'm not a transportation specialist, so I certainly benefited from that overview, and I can't imagine it being more clear. But I was struck by the lack of attention to gender in the variables. And I thought about it in several different ways. I wonder, maybe you're trying to be, I don't want to get on soapbox stuff, but couldn't you portray this big revolution as being driven that way? The rise in DMT corresponded in a time period when women's labor force participation was rising. But it has stopped rising since 2000, and maybe that's part of why the DMT is not going up. But I wonder if the hard-working moms in a minivan are also more open to these time-saving alternatives. And are they leading the revolution and not the men? I mean, there's no gender discussion, but I suspect that they might be looking for innovation or more press to it, perhaps. And so I wonder if they're going to lead us into the future, and what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, very interesting question. So people have looked at, the women in the labor force and its connection to VMT, and I think there is, I'm pretty sure there's a connection that's been made. We will definitely be looking at gender as a part of this, because I think there are still big gender differences among the millennials. Biking, for example, that's a very clear one. For all generations, men are bicycling more than women. But the one you raise about the what do we call it? Like the family support trips.
Well, other examples are like that. So.
Yeah. So, of course, with a lot of the millennials, if they aren't married yet with kids, then maybe that doesn't come into play yet. But for that, when you've hit that life stage, we need to look at that. I think it's going to be very interesting. Like the autonomous vehicles, if I could have just put my daughter in one of those instead of having to drive her, then I might not have pushed her to get her driver's license. Or aging parents and their ability to get around.
There is Uber for your kids now.
Yeah, and Uber so there are services like that. So I think it's gonna, so maybe the biking thing, we're trying to get women to bike more, but maybe that stays more something that men are willing to do, so they sort of uptake those kinds of options, whereas the women might uptake more on other options. I have heard that women are less, use Uber and Lyft less than men. And I think a personal security issue comes into play. But then if we're talking about autonomous vehicles, then maybe that goes away. So yes, I think gender is going to be a very interesting part of the story, but I'm not quite sure how. Yeah.
I was just wondering, to what extent have millennials been included in deciding what will be asked in the survey?
Well, good question. We had lots of students working on the survey, and in fact, Giovanni might himself qualify as a millennial, so he was in charge of the project. Yeah, and then we had a number of grad students contributing. Yeah, excellent question. This came up when we were designing our high school survey as well, because I don't know how to. Can you ask? Is driving cool? Do kids still say cool? Is that the right way to ask the question? So in that case, we worked with a club at the high school, and they helped us design the survey. It helped us think about what needed to be on there and how to word it. Yeah, so I think that's a very important general point, is that you need to be talking with the people you're going to be surveying to do a good job on your survey design. Yeah.
Yeah, what's a question, what's a comment? Regarding the plot of BMT, it seems like it started flattening out like around 2000. Does that mean that basically we reached saturation point in terms of how much vehicle miles our structure can take? And it seems, because if I'm looking at some of these other, and here comes the comment. If I'm looking at some of these other things that you're looking at, like Uber, actually, if everybody took Uber, I would think VMT would increase because of the extra deadhead miles that you have in the trip. So some of these other things actually would increase VMT if these were really the dominant factors. So I'm just wondering, does it go back to mean that what we're really looking at is the saturation point of our current infrastructure? And that's what these VMT plots are showing.
Yeah, so I think there are two saturations to think about. One is our personal saturation for how much time we can travel and how much time we're willing to spend in our car. And then there's the system saturation, right? And I think probably in LA you say we're just about at saturation for both, right? So if we, in a lot of places the system really is at capacity, which means that itself is making driving less attractive. It sort of dampens growth in VMT because you just can't fit more people in there, or it's going to become so onerous that people won't, so slow and annoying that you're just not going to want to get in your car to go places any more than you already are. So I think that, that could be factoring into it as well. Yeah, and on the personal side, well, that's where something like autonomous vehicles could make a big difference, because if suddenly you don't have to be the one doing the driving and being annoyed with everybody, your saturation level may go up. You may have a whole lot more capacity for being in a car than you did when you were doing the driving. Now, how these services play out, like I said, it really, we don't know. I mean, it could mean more travel. Almost any one of these things could mean more driving or less driving, or both, some combination, so that driving stays the same. And I think we just don't know enough to be sure at this point.
Susan, first I want to thank you for adding infrastructure to that stool of sustainability, and more importantly, the way we operate that infrastructure. I think intelligent transportation systems has a big part of efficiency and fuel savings, et cetera. But I'm curious your thoughts on the U.S. Department of Energy's announcement at the last ITS America annual meeting that they are engaging in the autonomous vehicles because of their interest in that facilitating electrification of the transportation network. Your thoughts then, what does that mean to VMT? Are we less concerned about VMT as related to GHG?
Ah, yeah, interesting. So I don't know the specifics of what they're proposing and all of that, but I guess I would answer kind of a more general question about if we, what if we fixed the emissions problem of our vehicles? What if, they weren't producing greenhouse gas emissions? Would we still want to get people to do something other than drive? And my personal opinion is yes, or at least that we'd want to still be creating good alternatives to driving. Because there, as I started out with, there are a lot of issues around driving other than just the emissions, and other than just the congestion. There are people who don't have access to the auto system as it currently operates. There's the sheer amount of land devoted to the auto system, the streets and the parking lots. The impact on our communities of having so much land devoted to cars and having so many cars circulating in our communities. I think there are a lot of good reasons to be doing the kinds of things that Portland, San Francisco, LA are doing, regardless of the is it electric or is it gas question. But people differ on that, so.
Just before, I just want to add a bit on that, because if we add 200 million cars, electric cars through our current system, we are still overloading our electricity network that is still highly based on fossil fuels. So sometimes the electric cars,
they're not a free ride.
Not here. But and in addition to that, the U.S. has the highest car share traffic rate per capita, cars per capita in the world. Just behind, I think, Liechtenstein and Monaco, maybe.
Oh.
I think it's like 8.5 vehicles for every 10 people. And developing countries, this policy seems to be what they want to achieve. That's what being developed country means. And if India or China they had this amount of cars per capita, they would not have fuel to put in these cars in this way. So the thing is, do you think there is any, do you have any hope that these rates start to decay? Not only in cars per capita.
Yeah. Well, most of my work is U.S. focused, and I mean the global questions are just huge. Yeah, and it raises equity issues, right? I mean, if we've had the freedom to buy cars and drive them around as much as we want, why can't everybody else in the world, you know, have that opportunity as incomes rise? But clearly we can't, you know, as a world, we can't sustain that. That's just not going to work. So I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, some of it, again, is the policies, the investments we make, and what direction those are heading in. Whether we do anything to restrict cars and driving, I don't know about that. I guess what gives me hope is lots of parts of Europe where, yeah, I mean, they do a lot of driving, but they do a heck of a lot of transit and biking as well, and live, you know, it's a very high quality of life. So, you know, with that as a model, can we convince other parts of the world that that's the way they should go?
So just a question about like size of cities, and if we have this back to city movement, are you comparing LA to San Francisco versus Portland? That's a very different mileage you're talking about. And so kind of like, are you doing an origin destination study, or is maybe the DMT decreasing because people are just not working the same distances, or are there other constraints that have people in certain locations or like developing cities? Like Portland has a limited city, or like those restricted city limits versus Los Angeles, a sprawling urban area. And are you doing comparisons that way with distance?
Yeah, I'm not personally, but people certainly are. And yeah, I mean, the whole, how does urban form, land development affect travel behavior? It's both the micro stuff, like what does our neighborhood look like, and do you have sidewalks and bike lanes? But it is also the size and the structure of the overall region. Jen's done a lot of work in this area as well. So yeah, not an easy question to answer. And it's not just about work, but it also non-work trips too, where, and some of my work shows this, that, you know, when you're in a region that offers you all these opportunities, you know, you don't just go to the closest shopping mall. Sometimes you drive across the city to go to that one you like over there. You've got these extra options almost directly translate into more travel as a whole. But what we do about that is a little more complicated.